So think about this, that Mr. Martin knew that this was a significant lead, and it was absolutely dumped by the Park Service. And I went to McCarter the next day after I talked to Mr. Martin to validate what he told me, and he confirmed it. He said, no, we knew that the Key family saw something darting between the trees, and it had something on its shoulder. I said, Dwight, how come this isn't going to the press? How come the press isn't plastering this on the front page of every paper in Knoxville? And then I even showed him every paper, and I said, it's nowhere in here. He just kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, yeah. So even to give the listeners a more educated perspective on this, is that when we were doing a release on the books, we brought the 4 networks from Knoxville into a motel conference room, and we laid out this Dennis Martin case to them. And just all of the factual evidence, no opinions at all, factual evidence. We had statements from McCarter, statements from Martin, the old newspaper articles, the refusal of the press to print it, and the leads pointing to what this was a significant event. Do you know there wasn't one media outlet in Knoxville that would touch this issue? Just like they wouldn't touch it in 1961, they would not, 1969, they would not touch it in 2012. A girl named Trini Gibson disappeared in 76. She was 16. And a woman named Thelma Melton disappeared in 81. She was 58. Talk about Gibson. She also disappeared in close proximity to the Appalachian Trail. She was with a high school group that was on a field trip, and she's walking on a trail with a group. Freedom of Information Act, I got all the documents, all the witness statements. The kids even wrote out statements of what they saw. And she's walking down a trail, and she's ahead of the group she's with, and a group sits down to take a rest. They see her walk down the trail. I've been on this trail, and it's thick. And there's a picture in the book where you're walking down that trail. On the right shoulder is bushes, and not far from the left shoulder is bushes. They see her stop on the trail and look off as she's looking at something. That was the description. She took one step off the trail. She was never seen again. Kids went down that trail a couple minutes later, and the descriptions were, we couldn't believe that she stepped off the trail in the place she did because it was a very small and steep creek bank. And you'll keep hearing this. The kids disappear near creeks, and they're found near creeks. And as many listeners have written to me before and reminded me, this is an area where you're not going to retain footprints and tracks. You can walk on rocks all day, and you're not going to find any tracks. Well, she stepped off in this area that nobody could believe she stepped off in, and there was an absolutely huge search. There were a lot of fingers pointed in other directions as a probable cause. She ran off with a boyfriend, but if you saw where she left the trail, that's a ridiculous and stupid assumption, because you could walk for days on this area of the Appalachian Trail or where she was at, and you would go nowhere. It's so far in the middle of nowhere, it's ridiculous. If she wanted to leave, she could have left from her home in the middle of the night and not been found. But at this point in history, she would have stepped out. She would have been known. She's never been found. They never found one evidence of her even being in the bush. There was no clothing. There was nothing of Trini Gibson ever found. And she, again, a reminder, she was the front person in line, steps off the trail, but never seen. Again, in 1981, a 58-year-old woman named Thelma Melton is staying in a group of trailers. People all knew each other. Older couples would stay right on the perimeter of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, but outside the park. A trail leading into the park starts at the end of this private camping area and goes up into the park. And every day for probably weeks, these older ladies take a hike up this trail. And they go a couple miles up, and they turn around and they come back. And the ladies, I think there was 4 or 5, walk up to the end of this one point where they turn around. This trail follows right next to a creek. Thelma starts stepping a little faster than they do. She gets 20, 30, 40 feet away. They see her. They're talking, oh, Thelma, you're pretty fast today. She laughs and says, yeah, I just want to get back to my trailer. and she goes over a short rise in the trail. And as the people come over the rise, they don't see her. And the other women think, she must have just hustled down the trail and she's already back. Well, as the trail dumps down into this private camping area, there's tons of trailers there, summer campers, etc. And everyone sees everyone coming off the trail, and nobody sees Thelma come back. And again, another massive search, and they find nothing. And she is never found. Her checks are never touched. Her bank accounts are never touched. Make a long story short, it's like Trenny and Thelma got plucked out, and who knows where they ever went. And the Park Service, again, does a search, comes up with no answers. And if you looked at the Great Smoky Mountains, you would think of them entirely different than you would the Rockies or the Sierras. They're not half as steep. They're not nearly as high. Yeah, there's thick foliage, but it's not the same hazard area that you think of with the Sierras or the Rockies. Now, some people wrote me and they said, well, it's obvious Dennis Martin must have fallen in a mine shaft or a cave. And we thought of that, and we wrote to the Park Service, and they advised us that all of the caves and shafts in that area were sealed in the early 60s before Dennis disappeared. And they claim that there are none now. And then other theories where there was a bear. I've heard tons of theories, but none that adequately explain the inconsistencies in the explanations and the distances that the Park Service has gone to cover up facts. Filed 2 different FOIA requests with the Army on the Green Berets, and not only did I get a denial, we filed 2 separate requests because we never got a response. We never got any response. We didn't get hey no or hey thanks. We got 0. The FBI is probably the hardest federal agency to get any information out of that I know of. Because if somebody is dead, they cite privacy issues in releasing information, even though the person is deceased. And if you allege they're deceased, they ask for a death certificate. They make you go to that level. We get the death certificate, and then they'll say, well, because of privacy rights, we're not going to release this information. So they make you run a distance, stop, and then wait for the denial. On the documents that we have received off of the Charles McCullough case in Crater Lake, where the person disappeared and his pants were found open, that case, yeah, we got a copy of a file that was so redacted, it looked like something out of Secret Service or CIA file. It was ridiculous. You know, as I was walking away from Mr. Martin's house, he had tears in his eyes. We had tears in our eyes. Honestly, I drove back with my partner, and I told him that in 30 years of investigating cases, talking to people in the workplace, being a police officer, that was the hardest conversation I've ever had with anybody. And, you know, maybe before I was a dad, it wouldn't have been as difficult, but I felt his pain, and I could see how it had essentially probably ruined this poor man's life with his wife, because it wasn't that far from his house that this happened, you know, probably an hour's drive. He never moved. He lived in the same house, and in fact, unbelievably, had the same phone number. And I'm sure that in the back of his mind, he was always hoping that Dennis was going to come back. And I think as a parent, you've got to always have hope or some type of closure. I mean, not knowing has to be one of the worst things for these people. When you do the investigation and you start looking at many of the facts of these cases, what struck me is that every one of these dads, on every one of these cases where these kids were never found, I'm telling you, they gave it the heroic effort to hang in there and to keep going and never to give up and to try and to be out there beating the bush every day. I thought, well, maybe it wouldn't happen as frequently, but every case I ran into, I mean, these fathers that were there, they never gave up. They didn't want to go home. You could just feel it. Talk about race for a second. It's very, very rare when you see somebody disappear other than a Caucasian. Oh, there were a couple of black people. Up until just recently, I had never seen an Asian person that had disappeared and not been found. And there was a professor from Oregon that was hiking alone just recently, within the last couple of years, and he disappeared. He was never found, and it's probably going to fall right into the criteria that we've set down. We're looking at that real hard. But no, it's mostly Caucasian. But wealthy, poor, it doesn't matter. I mean, there's a case out in New York we'll talk about later where a boy disappeared, probably one of the wealthiest families in the U.S. So no, it does seem as though, and it might have been the times that families, large families, seem to have kids that disappear more frequently than small families. And in talking amongst ourselves, we were starting to think that maybe that was an issue of the times in the 40s and the 50s, late 30s, especially for rural people, farmers, ranchers, and things. Having a large family was almost mandatory. And versus today, in a city dweller, having 10, 11 kids isn't very normal. And Marjorie is one of those cases I was just talking about that disappeared on the northern side of this wilderness designation in the northwestern part of Pennsylvania. She was with her family, and her dad was fishing in a small creek. Mom was sitting in a car. Girls were picking wildflowers, and she got out of sight just momentarily. And prior to that, her dad had said, "Hey, don't play by those big boulders because there's sometimes snakes there." And her sister thought that she walked over by this boulder, and it was one of those brief, and she's gone. And right around where Marjorie disappeared, there's another boy disappeared probably within 15 miles under equally strange circumstances and was never found. Absolutely a huge search for these people, and absolutely nothing. No clothing, no nothing. And Marjorie's case played headlines for a number of months, and it's just one of those perplexing things that a few seconds out of your sight, and these boulders come up many times when you're in the woods. Either evidence is found in or near them, or people are in amongst them, and something happens. And going back to Yosemite real quick, Yosemite's covered by miles and miles of huge granite and exposed granite. And a lot of times these people are disappearing in amongst areas where there isn't a lot of cover. There's a lot of boulders. It's an interesting dilemma to think about. So Douglas and Dennis have a lot of similarities in my mind. So Douglas Legg, he was from New York, and his uncle was a banker from New York and very wealthy man. His name was Crandall Melvin. This occurred in July of '71 in an area called Newcomb, New York. And it happened at Newcomb Lake, and his family owned a 13,000-acre estate that essentially surrounded this lake in a beautiful area. And the family went there to vacation with other members of the extended family. And Douglas was with his uncle, and they were going to go on a small hike. And he came out, and he was dressed inappropriately. And his uncle told him, "Hey, you got to go back to the lodge and change." And the lodge was in sight. And some kids were in the lake, and they were yelling at Douglas, "Hey, come on, blah, blah, blah." And he was talking to him, and he walked off and around a small ridge where his uncle was waiting and headed towards the lodge. And make a long story short, he never made it back to the lodge, and he was never seen again. And this is in a long driveway up to this lodge. Nobody comes up here. It's very restricted, just family. Nobody's there 90% of the time. There's some swamps in the upper northern reaches of the property, and there's an area called the High Peaks area as you're going towards Lake Placid. Very rough, very rugged area. Dennis disappears, and the family pulls everything out that they can to find this boy. Douglas disappears. The family pulls everything out to find the boy. And they make a call to California for some special canines and special search and rescue teams and they fly them in. And